It is wonderful to be back with you for worship after a much needed break. Although I had booked the study leave before the vacation leave, I found myself so exhausted on the first day of leave that I had to do the vacationing part first. I spent the first 2 full days of leave sitting at the Georgian Bay shore, listening to the water, trying really hard to think or pray or meditate, and finally just surrendering from all of these active things to a much more passive, just sitting and listening. Listening to the waves, listening to the sound of the wind, the occasional bird call, and the sounds of other people who were enjoying the beach. God was really faithful to my passive, silent waiting, and before too long, the tiredness and worry and angst and fear of the past few months evaporated, and in place of it came a really calm stillness, that peace that passes all understanding. I took many things with me to read, and I had planned on spending a lot more time, especially with my Bible, but it ended up that I just spent the time mostly just sitting with God, walking with God, swimming with God, just being present with God, or allowing God to be present with me. I was alone for a lot of the time, but not isolated, because that presence of spirit was powerful, and it was a time of experiencing faith without scaffolding. I think we have many rituals and traditions that scaffold our faith, and COVID has definitely challenged our scaffolding. When I began my leave, a big part of my exhaustion was from thinking about all the risks involved in moving us from worshiping in isolation back to in-person worship, or worship together. I remembered in a very bodily way during this time off that we are given faith through the enormous grace of God alone. And it's not the scaffolding or the traditions that provides the faith, but rather the faith that gives us reason for the scaffolding and the traditions and the structure. And so it is that in our gospel reading today, when we encounter Jesus having a bit of a hissy fit at the Pharisees and religious scholars, his hissy fit is kind of about the difference between scaffolding and faith. Jesus' claim is that they are focused, to paraphrase a little bit, that they are focused, the Pharisees and the religious scholars are focused more on the scaffolding than on the faith. And in Matthew chapter 15, in the verse that precedes the reading, Jesus cites the prophet Isaiah. And this is what he says: "These people make a big show of saying the right thing, but their heart is not in it. They act like they're worshiping me, but they don't mean it. They just use me as a cover for teaching whatever suits their fancy." Jesus cites Isaiah as a way of expressing that he is angry and irritated. He is irate that those charged with the responsibility of teaching and leading in the faith are focused more on the scaffolding than on the faith itself. They are focused more on the scaffolding than on the spirit of love and relationship that is at the very center of that which God calls us to. This is why he uses the words from Isaiah. They act like they're worshiping me, but they don't mean it. It is not from the heart. Jesus uses a particular set of traditions to explain himself, referring to food purity rules and even hand washing. In the laws given to Moses, there were many rules about food as well as cleanliness, but none of these rules or laws was meant to supersede or outweigh the rule to love God first, and then the rule to love our neighbors as ourselves. These laws and rules were given as a bit of scaffolding, but they were not meant to be the central thing. And the thing about love, the love of God and the love for our neighbors, is that it springs from within us. It is not about what we put into our bodies in terms of food purity. It's not about how carefully we clean ourselves or sanitize. But love is something that springs from the very center of our beings, gushing and welling up out of us as if we were that spring of life that Jesus talks about in the Gospel of John. And this love that gushes and wells up out of us is available to us if and when we are deeply, deeply connected with God. Now, if we are focused more on the scaffolding of our faith, it is easy for things like worry and angst and fear to get in the way of love. It's easy for things like a controlling nature or a show-off attitude to take charge of how we conduct ourselves when our focus is on the scaffolding of rituals and traditions, but not on our faith in and our love for Jesus. And this is why Jesus is having his hissy fit in the gospel reading. A hissy fit which, as often happens, seems to fly over the disciples' head. Jesus is halfway down the road with his hissy fit, and the disciples are probably there scratching their heads going, what is he carrying on about? Peter is the one who says to Jesus, I don't get it. Put it in plain language. And here, Jesus explains that when we eat, we consume and digest something that is from the outside. It is, for want of a more polite way of putting things, a situation where we put something in and it simply comes out the other end. But Jesus goes on to explain that what comes out of our mouths bears the evidence of our hearts. Let's think about that a little bit more. What emerges from our mouths bears the evidence of our hearts. Or what comes out of the mouth gets its start in the heart. So if our hearts are not focused on the love of God in Jesus and what that all means, if our hearts are instead focused on some self-centered thing, like our own importance as individual saviors of the world, for example, then what comes out of our mouth bears evidence of that. Ego, boasting, controlling. And maybe one of the things that does not come out of our mouth bears evidence of that when we don't make enough silence to hear what other people are saying or experiencing or feeling. If, on the other hand, our hearts are focused on God who is love, the things that come from our lips bear the fruits of Holy Sacred Spirit. What happens when we live God's way? We hear in Galatians about the fruits of the Spirit. God brings gifts into our lives much the same way that fruit appears in an orchard. Things like affection for others, exuberance about life, serenity. We develop a willingness to stick with things, a sense of deep compassion in the heart, and a conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people. All things and all people are sacred. We find ourselves involved in loyal commitments, not needing to force our way in life, able to marshal and direct our energies wisely. What an amazing set of gifts we bear. What an amazing set of fruits of the Holy Sacred Spirit come to us when we are focused on God who is love. Jesus has just finished explaining this to the disciples about the difference between focusing on God versus focusing on the scaffolding, when he gets the opportunity to practice what he preaches. Jesus is challenged by a foreign woman, a non-Israelite, who is asking for her daughter to be healed. His initial response seems to be somewhat scaffolding oriented, as he refuses to help her, saying, "Look, I've got my hands full tending to the lost sheep of Israel." But this woman does not take the answer and meekly go away. Instead, she reaches past the scaffolding into his heart and summons from him the compassion that would be offered even to the dogs under the table when scraps are passed to them from the feast. Jesus is quick to turn around, demonstrating the humility that comes from taking correction well. And from that place of faith in the heart, the Canaanite woman's daughter is healed. Not because she had all the right rituals and traditions, but because she had faith, and because Jesus had love in his heart. Jesus practices what he preaches, allowing love and the fruits of love to prevail. And these actions remind me of the last two verses of our hymn of the day, and I think these words came from Laurie's pen. Help us to live in the ways that you have taught us, giving to others wherever there is need, sharing our love with our every thought and action, turning from anger and hatred and greed. Lord, as we offer our lives here before you, send down your Spirit on wings of a dove. Grace so amazing it knows no measure, circles us, holds us, and wraps us in love. May it be so with each one of us. Amen.